Leanna Schooley. I'm the Assistant Director for the Center for Texas Studies. We welcome you all to this workshop series, which we have the first Saturday morning of every month. If you are not on our mailing list for future programs and would like to please see me afterwards. We send out a monthly email blast, and that information is also available on our website, which is simply www.texasstudies.com. So you can check that information out there as well. We're able to bring you the speakers for our program through a very generous grant from the Summerlee Foundation. And our speaker today is Dr. T. Lindsay Baker. He has been a professor of history and director of the W.K. Gordon Center for Industrial History of Texas, my former employer, as a matter of fact, at Thurber, Texas. I think I said he's been there since 2002. He has written a number of books on Texas history, and his most recent is the Gangster Tour of Texas. You may have seen it featured in the January issue of Texas Highways that's now on the stands, and he will be signing copies of the book after today's program if you are interested. And today's program is one of the stories featured in the book about the kidnapping or the Urschel kidnapping over in Wise County. So I will let him give you all the details about that. If you would, Dr. T. Lindsay Baker.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to come to Fort Worth and to tell you about an interesting criminal incident. An incident that involved the richest man in Oklahoma and one of the most famous of the gangsters of the Depression era, Machine Gun Kelly. Now, this is one of 16 criminal enterprises that I've written about in the Gangster Tour of Texas. And Tour is not a clever title for a book. This is a guidebook. This is a tour that leads the readers to the actual places where the crimes took place. It's a guidebook to historic crime scenes with maps, directions, photographs of the crime scenes as they appear today, so that you too can win your way down the hill in the little Cottondale Cemetery near Paradise in Wise County and find the grave with the mortal remains of Machine Gun Kelly beneath a little concrete tombstone about the size of a shoebox, with his name intentionally misspelled to ward off people who might deface it. Yeah, it's a guidebook. You also can go to Mulkey Street here in Fort Worth and see the bungalow where he and Catherine Kelly partied while their gang members in Wise County held Charles Urschel for ransom. The house is still there. It's still a residence in the Morningside edition, and a very pretty bungalow at that. Ms. Schooley asked me to tell you a little bit about how, as a historian, I came up with the idea of writing a book like this, and then what historical resources proved to be the most useful to me in writing the book. And what could be better than to be in the Fort Worth Public Library, which is one of the places where I did conduct research for the book. This is heaven on earth. In 1997, I went to the Western History Association's annual meeting in St. Paul, Minnesota. And being a person who typically likes to connect place and events in the past, I very often go on the tours associated with these meetings, and one of the tours one I chose to go on, was based on research by Paul Maccabee, and it was a tour of organized crime sites in Minneapolis and St. Paul. You know, we drove over the intersection where the Ham of the Ham's Beer Empire was abducted in a kidnapping. We went to the South St. Paul post office where the Barker Carpus gang staged a meatpacking plant robbery. We drove by the apartment building where John Dillinger lived for a while. And I bought a copy of Maccabee's book that the Minnesota Historical Society published with the delightfully clever name, John Dillinger Slept Here. And I carried it into the book exhibit room at the convention to my Texas A&M Press editor, Mary Lynn Dixon, who some of you all, I'm sure, probably know. And I said, hey, Mary Lynn, look at this. Wouldn't this be fun to do for Texas? And she looked through the book and said, yes, I think it would. Will you send me a prospectus? Which I did. They accepted the proposal, and I started looking for crime scenes. And I decided, in dealing with a book on the subject, I wanted to deal with the 20th century. There are plenty of books on outlaws and highwaymen, but there's not so much about crime in 20th century Texas. So I decided that I would look at what in my stereotypical view was the gangster era, and I started with the beginning of prohibition in Texas. And you know, Texas legislature voted dry a full year ahead of national prohibition. People say Texas is behind in everything. We were #1 in prohibition. We voted a year ahead of national prohibition. So you can't say Texas is behind everywhere. And then I decided that a bookend to end it that would probably make good sense to most readers was the closing of the illegal casinos in Galveston by the Texas Rangers in 1957-56. And so that ends the story. Then I decided, well, what sort of crime are we going to look at? And the definition of organized crime that I adopted is virtually the almost, well, it's not word for word, but it's essentially what's in the Texas criminal statutes. And that is that organized crime is any activity in which 2 or more people conspire to break the law for personal gain. So I decided we're going to look at crimes of greed. Every story in the book is a story of greed and how it affects people. There are no psychopaths, there's no weirdos, there are no crimes of passion. Everything's based on taking something that belongs to somebody else. It works just fine. Now, where do you go when you're trying to put together a guidebook of crime scenes? Well, it requires a combination of work in libraries and archives, special collections, and work in the field. So I went through all the regular published journals in Texas history, the State Journal, and all the regional ones like Password from the El Paso County Historical Society and East Texas Historical Association, all Panhandle Plains Historical Society's journal they've been doing since 1928. And I identified a whole list of potential organized crime enterprises. And then I started going to the places where the events took place. Well, when you're writing a heritage tourist guidebook, you've got to find places that are of interest to tourists. You know, W.D. Jones, who was in the Barra Gang, was arrested in Houston in an old ramshackle wooden boarding house on the south side of downtown Houston, but today it's an asphalt parking lot near the Sunkist Stadium. That's not an interesting place to go. Despite the fact that an important event took place, it's uninteresting. So I began Xing off some of the criminal enterprises because the crime scenes weren't worth going to see. They weren't worth going to see. It had no connection with what it was like in the past. So then I began putting together a list of the crime scenes where there were a lot to see. And in the case of the Urschel kidnapping, there's a lot to see. It meant some of the really good stories didn't get into the book. It didn't say that they aren't significant, but it's a heritage tourist guidebook. Where did I go? I went to places like the Fort Worth Public Library, where the Fort Worth Press is on microfilm. Star Telegram's on microfilm any number of places. If you want the press, this is where I came to do it. Another local resource that was immensely valuable to me was the newspaper clipping morgue of the Fort Worth Star Telegram that a number of years ago was donated to special collections at the University of Texas at Arlington. Now, over the years, lowly paid employees of the Star Telegram clipped articles published in the Star Telegram and put them in identified envelopes so that when a reporter had a story to write, he could go back, pull out the clippings, see what already had been in the Star Telegram about the incident, the individual, the location, and basically have a good part of the research already done. Newspapers were business enterprises. They weren't putting together those clipping morgues because an old bald-headed historian someday might want to look something up. And they were much more, and these began in the 1920s and go through the 1960s, time period I was interested in. What made them especially valuable and made them more valuable to me than, for example, the computer-based word searchable Dallas Morning News, which was valuable, is that a human brain had put the clipping morgue together for the Star Telegram. And that human brain picked up connections between historical incidents that a word search on a computer would never turn up. Similarly, courthouse records, court records. In one instance, one of the El Paso County stories is a still unsolved murder from the 1930s having to do with immigrant smuggling on the border, smuggling of Asian Indians across the border in El Paso County. What an unexpected story. The murder's never been solved. It's still a live case. And for the first time as a historian, I had to file a Freedom of Information Act request in order to secure a photocopy of that still live murder investigation from the 1930s. Oral interviews with people in the places were essential, as well as interviews with people and descendants of people who were involved in the actual criminal incidents. Yeah. To give you some idea, the sorts of stones that a historian turns over in doing grassroots research in his home state. Well, one of the stories that I thought ought to be told was the story of the 1933 Urschel kidnapping. It turned out to have especially rich sources. Some of the actual participants themselves wrote about it at the time, like E. Kirkpatrick, who carried the ransom money to Machine Gun Kelly. Harvey Bailey, arguably the most successful bank robber in American history, was interviewed in the 1950s by Texas historian J. Evetts Haley, who went to Missouri several times and interviewed him after he got out of federal penitentiary. So we have accounts of that incident from one of the actual criminals himself, describing it as he saw it in his own words. And you'll hear some of his words this morning. So With sources like that, how could I not tell the story of Charles Urschel and his kidnappers? Are you ready to go to Oklahoma City with me to start the story?
Let's go.
It's hot summertime. It's not January. It's the end of July, and it's hot and sticky. Air conditioning is not available except maybe in a movie house. The Urschels were on a screened porch of their mansion where they could pick up a few evening breezes blowing through the screens. Charles F. Urschel and his wife, Berenice, were playing bridge with friends Walter R. Jarrett and his wife on the screened porch of the Urschel home in Oklahoma City on the warm evening of July 22nd, 1933. Out of the darkness appeared two armed men. "Stick 'em up. We want Urschel." "Which man is Urschel?" they snapped. Since neither man answered, one of the gunmen ordered, "We'll take you both." Urschel was no ordinary businessman. He had served for years as the financial manager for Tom B. Slick, the king of the wildcatters, the richest man in Oklahoma. After Slick's death in 1930, Urschel continued running his empire and in time married Slick's widow, Berenice. Interestingly, Urschel's own wife was Berenice's sister, and she had died prematurely. So he ended up being the husband of two sisters. The two hoodlums were no ordinary thugs either. One was bank robber Albert L. Bates, and the other was no less than George Barnes, known to criminals and lawmen alike as Machine Gun Kelly. Determining which abductee on that summer night was indeed Urschel, the kidnappers ejected Jarrett from their car 9 miles east of Oklahoma City and took a circuitous route southward, crossing the Red River into Texas. Their destination was a farm outside Paradise, southwest of Decatur, owned by the stepfather of George Kelly's wife, Catherine. There, they held Urschel captive for 9 days. The motive behind the abduction was ransom money from Berenice Urschel. Lots of money. The kidnappers demanded $200,000 in used $20 bills and stipulated a very quick pickup of the cash to deter lawmen from recording all the serial numbers on the banknotes. Remember, 1933, you could buy a brand new Ford V8 automobile for $500. $200,000 was a huge sum of money. Urschel's friend, E.E. Kirkpatrick, who wrote one of the accounts of the incident, made the money delivery in Kansas City on Sunday, July 30th, 1933, 8 days after the abduction. The next evening, a disheveled man approached the back door of the Urschel mansion. It was the missing Charles F. Urschel, who had been carried to the outskirts of Norman, just south of Oklahoma City, and was left at the side of the road. Kelly, Bates, and their accomplices congratulated themselves on what they believed had been a perfect crime. Catherine Kelly had planned the kidnapping. Her husband and Bates had engineered the abduction, collected the ransom money, and returned the victim. Catherine's mother, stepfather, and stepbrother had helped hold the oil financier on their Texas farm. While captive Urschel's eyes were covered with adhesive tape, except for a few minutes to write a letter and then again to shave, before his release, George and Catherine Kelly spent part of their time in a Fort Worth safe house, the house on Mulkey Street, miles away from the farm. Although Urschel had only brief moments to see his captors, what Kelly and the others did not realize was that Charles F. Urschel was not just a financial genius. He had what today might be called a photographic memory, the uncanny ability to remember vividly the tiniest details of his ordeal. Mrs. Schooley, could I ask for a glass of water? I failed to bring some with me.
There's a bottle of water underneath the buggy.
Is that advanced planning or what? You guys are in remarkably good hands. It's just that I'm already getting too excited about this. On the 14-hour trip to Texas, the blindfolded Urschel made mental notes of the noises he heard. Once delivered to the farm of Robert G. Boss Shannon outside Paradise, Texas, Urschel remembered every sound. A bull, 4 milk cows, chickens, a flock of guineas, and even snippets of conversation about a local teenaged prostitute. He noted rainfall and wind. Even though he was kept in chains, the captive consciously left clear fingerprints on smooth surfaces like window panes and a bedstead. Most importantly, he noted hearing the regular drone of an airplane. He surreptitiously queried his captors about the time of day, noting that the plane passed overhead at 9:15 a.m. and 5:45 p.m. Finally, he roughly calculated the travel time from the hideout back to Oklahoma, 6 hours shorter than the trip the night of his abduction. From the outset of the kidnapping, the Urschel family placed itself in the hands of the local sheriff and agents of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Investigation. Officers fed the press only the information they wanted the abductors to know. The very evening that the fatigued and careworn Charles Urschel stumbled to his own back door, Monday, July 31st, 1933, Special Agent Gus Jones plied him with questions. The federal lawman must have smiled to himself when he discovered the remarkable recall that the oil man offered. Just Urschel's observation that he heard the kidnapper's car rattle across the bumpy Canadian River Bridge between Lexington and Purcell, Oklahoma, going and coming from activity, plus his estimate of the 8-hour driving time during his release, pointed southward toward Texas. Jones assigned investigators to find out what localities to the south experienced the same sequence of rain and wind that Urschel remembered, and to check commercial airline schedules. They quickly concluded that the airplane sounds at the crime scene likely came from a daily American Airlines flight between Meacham Field in Fort Worth and Amarillo. Agents in their own light plane flew over the American Airlines route, looking for a farm that fit Urschel's description. When they located such a farm in southwestern Wise County, Texas, in an area that had experienced the distinctive sequence of weather, Jones dispatched Agent Edward Dowd to the neighborhood. The investigator arrived there only 3 days after Urschel's release, visiting in the guise of a mortgage salesman. Dowd confirmed what the oil man remembered. The house had a broken window pane patched with cardboard. The floorboards ran the right directions. He saw the correct number of cattle, mules, and even guineas. When the agent asked for a drink of water on the hot summer day, the pulley at the well made the right squeak, and the water had the same mineralized taste that Urschel described. In the vicinity, Dowd learned about the same teenage prostitute that the Oklahoman had heard of. There was no question in the lawman's mind. He had found the crime scene. Meanwhile, George Kelly and Albert Bates absconded with the ransom money, splitting it between them. George and wife Catherine initially went to Cleveland, Chicago, and Des Moines, but then returned to Texas. They headed to Coleman County, where Catherine had lived as a teenager and where her uncle, Cass E. Coleman, lived on a farm 13 miles south of the county seat of Coleman, Texas. In mid-August, Cass and Kelly buried $73,250 near a tree in a cotton field. Cass then found a tenant shack for Kelly to rent as a hideout on the farm of Will Casey, 15 miles east of Coleman. George and Catherine then departed, hiding out in Biloxi and elsewhere, but spending time in a bungalow at 160 Mankey Court, today 1058 Steves Avenue in San Antonio. Still a residence to this day. Even in the third week of September 1933, the couple headed to Memphis, Tennessee. But let's return to the story in Texas. Having identified the farm where Urschel was held, federal agents joined Texas officers to raid the site. They reached Decatur, the seat of Wise County, at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Friday, August 11th, 1933. Fearing they might lose some of their quarry if darkness fell, they decided to postpone the incursion until the next morning. Officers gathered at the Blackstone Hotel in Fort Worth at 4 o'clock the next morning and headed in several cars toward Paradise and thence via a sandy county road to the Shannon farm. To maintain secrecy, some of the junior officers had not even been informed where they were going. Fort Worth policeman Charlie G. Carmichael remarked in the car, "I wish they'd tell us what to expect when we get to where we're going." The stranger next to him spoke up. "I thought you knew. I'm Charles Urschel, the man kidnapped. We're going after them." The Oklahoman was included in the group to identify the kidnappers by the sounds of their voices. Unknown to the officers, the overnight delay would enable them to arrest one of the most notable American criminals of their day. Harvey Bailey arguably had been the most successful bank robber in the history of the United States. By a quirk of coincidence, he chose the night before the raid on the Shannon farm to return a borrowed Thompson submachine gun to George Kelly. Having been awake for 2 days and nights before he got to the Paradise farmstead, he remembered, "I was dead to the world." Boss Shannon gave Bailey some money that George Kelly owed him and encouraged him to get some sleep on a cot outside the house. Remember, this was hot summertime, and people used to sleep in the yard in the heat of the summer. Shannon said, "I'll wake you up early in the morning and then you can be on your way." Instead, in the semi-darkness just before dawn, FBI agent Gus Jones awakened Harvey Bailey with the muzzle of a machine gun. "When I woke up, there was 5 of them around me. They had me covered and 14 times over. They took me right to Dallas." While newspapers were reporting the capture of Harvey Bailey, mistakenly as the head of the kidnap gang, officers lodged him with others in the jail portion on the upper level of the Dallas County Criminal Courts building. All of you in this room know the building. It fronts on Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas. It's known to most people as the place where Jack Ruby was killed. It's still a municipal courts building to this day. Without delay, federal authorities began steps to prosecute Harvey Bailey, members of the Shannon family, and other gang members for the abduction of Charles Urschel. While they continued to hunt for other participants in the crime, they erroneously told the press that Harvey Bailey had been the brains behind the events. A federal grand jury met in Oklahoma City and on August 23rd indicted 14 individuals for kidnapping, including Harvey Bailey. His bail was set at $100,000. The case was the first major crime prosecuted under the newly passed federal statute against transporting people across state lines against their wills. Congress had passed the law the year before in 1932 in response to the Charles A. Lindbergh baby kidnapping. Following the indictment, federal authorities began moving accused gang members from Dallas to Oklahoma City for trial. but Bailey remained in one of the cells on the 9th floor of the Dallas jail. Completed in 1915, the multi-story criminal courts building was designed so that the only access to the jail on top was by way of a well-protected elevator. Officers viewed it as escape-proof. Then, on August 28th, U.S. Marshals received a court order to move Bailey to Oklahoma City for trial. 3 days later, another federal grand jury, this time in Kansas City, indicted Harvey Bailey for having participated in the June 17, 1933 Gangland Union Station massacre that he also had nothing to do with. During all this time, the actual organizers of the Urschel kidnapping, Catherine and George Kelly, were still on the run, successfully dodging officers as they moved around the country. While these events swirled in the world outside, Harvey Bailey sweated in the summertime heat of his 9th floor steel cell inside the Dallas County Jail. His only contact with an attorney had been to dispose of his automobile left back at the Shannon farm. On August 24th, he had been taken under heavy guard to Fort Worth for arraignment in advance of the planned trial in Oklahoma City. Harvey knew that the only legitimate evidence that connected him with the kidnapping was the fact that he had been apprehended on the Shannon farm, and that at the time he had in his pocket several $100s from George Kelly. It was only after his arrest that Harvey learned that the officers had indeed recorded the serial numbers of every banknote and the $200,000 ransom, and that Kelly had paid part of his debt to Bailey using $540 from those bills. Knowing that he'd been caught, but feeling confident that the kidnapping could not be pinned on him, Bailey expected nothing worse than to be returned to the Kansas penitentiary from which he'd escaped that spring. About this time, Harvey began having jail cell visits from Harold Nathan, who J. Edgar Hoover, as head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had flown to Texas to pursue the kidnapping investigation. Bailey remembered, "I was in jail in Dallas, and I got word they were going to put me away." An agent declared, quote, "Right or wrong, we've got orders to put you away from Washington." If federal authorities could not convict him for his other crimes, they at least could imprison him as a conspirator in the Urschel kidnapping. Harvey realized that there was no way he could escape the legal system that was pitted against him. He could, however, escape another way, through the doors of the seemingly impregnable Dallas County Criminal Courts building. Harvey communicated with a man who in the interviews he described as a local man in Dallas, consciously not wanting to give the person's name, who identified a jail employee to whom he could go, quote, "anytime I wanted anything," unquote. That person was Sheriff's Deputy Tom L. Mannion. While Bailey was in Fort Worth being arraigned for his forthcoming trial, Mannion secreted an outdated Bisley model Colt .45 revolver 4 cartridges, and a hacksaw blade under the pillow on his bed. In conversation, when he delivered Bailey's evening meal, Mannion asked him, hypothetically, if he was going to attempt an escape, which route he would take. Which side of the canal will you go on? The jailer asked, canal meaning the leveed Trinity River. Which side of the canal will you go on? Suspecting some double cross, the inmate replied, on this side. The minute I cross over the bridge, I'll take the first inner road. Bailey realized that somehow he was being set up, but he didn't yet understand how. Even so, he knew for sure that federal authorities were attempting to pin the Urschel kidnapping on him. He furthermore remembered the words of Sheriff's Deputy Bill Decker to the jail staff about his meals. Give that boy anything he wants. The federal government is gonna frame him and burn him to death. Harvey Bailey decided to act before it was too late. On the night of September 3rd, 1933, Bailey cut away 2 large iron bars near the bottom of his jail cell door with the hacksaw blade. Rubbing his fingers raw, he managed to cut through the bars, and a little before dawn, he squeezed himself through an opening only 9 1/4 by 15 1/4 inches. He then hid in a toilet across from the row of cells. When Deputy Sheriff C.W. Young and a black trustee came up the elevator with Bailey's breakfast about 7 o'clock a.m. and walked toward the cell, the seasoned criminal, Colt revolver in hand, demanded, "Gimme the keys. Gimme the keys." Locking the 2 men in his own cell, Bailey used one of the keys to open the door from the corridor to the elevator and let himself down 3 floors. Gun in hand, Bailey got the drop on the turnkey on duty there, ordering him into a nearby cell. Then out of the elevator door from downstairs came 3 more officers and another black elevator operator. Harvey shut up the 3 officers, but ordered the operator, "All right, let's go down." At ground level, Bailey emerged from the elevator to find yet another jailer, Nick Trisp. The officer tossed the escapee a set of keys, but Harvey responded for him to lock up the black trustee. "All right, you and I are going out," Bailey declared. They exited the building, crossed the alley, and walked into a garage where Trisp had parked his Model A Ford automobile. Harvey Bailey had just made his way out of the supposedly escape-proof Dallas County Criminal Courts building. With the pistol under his leg in the car seat, Harvey Bailey wheeled out with hostage Nick Trisp. Never hesitating, the criminal headed in the direction he had told Deputy Tom Mannion he would take, just to see what he would find. "I seen him and this fella in a Chevrolet parked in this service station. They was watching for me, waiting for me." Knowing that Mannion and his partner had indeed planned an ambush, Harvey Bailey left them to continue waiting as he and his hostage headed north. Later it was learned that Mannion had intended to run against Sheriff Smoot Smith in the next election, and he had hoped that his arrest of an escaped Harvey Bailey would make his name for the electoral contest. Bailey and Trisp proceeded out of Dallas, through Gainesville, across the Red River Bridge, and on through Marietta and Ardmore, Oklahoma. Harvey was getting all the speed that Trisp's four-cylinder Ford would offer. But a cloudburst near Ardmore muddied the roads so that the little car bogged down and splashed up mud that clogged the front of its radiator, causing the engine to overheat. They turned back into Ardmore, where officers recognized the stolen car and gave chase. The Ardmore Press reported a mad race through the residential section, with the bandit recklessly hurling the Ford sedan around corners and through crowded traffic, ended when he swung too sharply around the corner of Washington and 2nd, and the car crashed into the curbing at the Mulkey Hotel. Hotel still stands in Ardmore. You can go to the site. Within moments, law officers surrounded the car, and Harvey Bailey surrendered without resistance. Since Bailey in his escape had driven himself halfway to Oklahoma City, the scene for the kidnapping trial, lawmen transported him the rest of the way there. George and Catherine Kelly were caught in Memphis on the morning of Tuesday, September 28, 1933. They were flown to Oklahoma City, where all the principals in the Urschel kidnapping were convicted. 22-year-old Armand Shannon received a suspended sentence of 10 years for his truthful testimony in court, despite the fact that he had guarded the abductee. Even though Harvey Bailey had nothing whatever to do with the kidnapping, he was sentenced to life in prison as a part of the conspiracy, proved by his possession of some of the ransom money. George Kelly, R.G. Shannon, Albert Bates, and Harvey Bailey all went to the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, while Catherine Kelly and her mother, Ora Shannon, went to a penal institution for women, all of them with life sentences. When the U.S. Department of Justice opened a new maximum security prison on Alcatraz Island in California, it transferred Kelly, Bates, and Bailey there. While the trials in Oklahoma City grabbed the headlines, postscripts followed in Texas. Once court testimony revealed that Cass Coleman and Will Casey had aided the kidnappers, attention shifted to the retrieval of ransom money. Officers descended on the Cass Coleman farm on the night of September 26-27, 1933. With flashlights, Coleman led local and federal officers to two spots in his cotton field where he and George Kelly had hidden a thermos bottle and a syrup can filled with $73,250 in cash. Coleman was prosecuted for helping the kidnappers secret the loot, and Casey for providing Kelly with a hiding place. In the San Angelo trial, Coleman received a 1-year sentence and Casey 2 years. Weeks later, the dragnet netted another Texan, Louise Magnus of San Angelo. This girlhood friend of Catherine Kelly provided an automobile while the couple were on the lam. Court in April 1934 assessed her 1 year and a day in prison for this transgression. 20 years passed. In 1954, 2 decades later, George Kelly died in federal prison. His body went unclaimed. So a released R.G. Boss Shannon in Texas agreed to bury him in a plot that he owned at the Cottondale Cemetery south of Paradise in Wise County. There, beneath a homemade concrete marker, lie the remains of the man who coined the term still used for the FBI when he declared at his Memphis arrest, "I knew you G-men would get me." Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor for questions, but I want to ask one first, and that is if there's anyone in the audience with old family connections to these events. Very often in a program like this, there are 1 or 2 people whose family members were touched by the events. I had a great uncle in Newcastle, Texas, who was barber. And one of our family stories that comes down in the Baker family is his story of having shaved a man in Newcastle in 1933 who he believed was Machine Gun Kelly. And he loved to tell the story of having held the straight razor at the throat of Machine Gun Kelly, but having the wisdom not to do anything. Anyone here with such family stories that come down? Yes, ma'am.
My maternal grandfather ran bootleg liquor for the mob in Detroit during Prohibition, and one of his relatives was Giovanni Vitale, the first mafia don in Detroit in 1916. He and his son got whacked in 1920, and they're all buried together up there in Detroit.
Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Well, the publicity showed the Machine Gun Kelly's last name is Barnes. So how did the name Kelly become attributed to it?
I don't know exactly how it was attributed, but it was the nickname that he used. Catherine Kelly was really the brains of the gang, and she set things up for him to master the use of the machine gun, and he had never used machine guns until under his wife's influence. He started doing it and practicing, going out in the country, and some of the time up at Paradise, just to become adept in their use. But she truly was the mastermind of the gang. She planned the Urschel kidnapping. Her plan was to kill Urschel once that the gang received the ransom money, and the men overpowered her and said, "No, we said we let him go, and we will." Of course, none of them knew at the time that he had a photographic memory. But she wanted simply to murder him once they got the money. Absolutely cold-blooded and stunningly beautiful. A real clothes horse. She wore absolutely the finest in garments, and the stories are still told about how beautiful she was. Yeah, incredible. She and her mother both ended up in federal prison for women.
And where was that?
If I'm not mistaken, Missouri, but I'd have to look at my notes to tell you exactly.
Did she die in prison?
She and her mother both were released at fairly advanced age and had a few years after they were paroled, but the mother didn't live very long. There are still Shannons living in Wise County. I don't know if it's still, if he's still there, but there was a school board member who was one of the Shannons when I was doing the research. So the Shannons are very much there, and these are the descendants of, I guess it would be Armand Shannon.
How many people did you talk to who were directly related or were most dead by the time you started your research?
In most of the instances, the first person people were gone. So it was people who'd lived around at the time. So, and local interviewees were keys to identifying many of the crime scenes. The tenant shack where Urschel was actually held no longer stands, but the farmhouse that was the headquarters for the kidnappers still stands, but it's been, its exterior has a modern brick veneer, and unless you compare the photographs of the house today with the house in 1933, you would drive past it and never know that it was the headquarters of the kidnappers. But when you see the two pictures, you see it's exactly the same floor plan. The chimney's where it was in 1933, but to the casual observer, you wouldn't recognize it at all, as opposed to the safe house on Mulkey Street that's virtually unchanged.
The people who live in these homes, do they mind the history and people?
The property owners, sometimes they're pleased and sometimes wish that the historian just bury his head in the sand, which is understandable. That's understandable. Yes, sir.
Did anybody not know that they lived in a famous house until you told them?
Oh yeah, there are people in the towns who never knew that incidents took place. Yeah, enough time has passed. The bank that Rebecca Branley Rogers robbed at gunpoint in 1926 in the little town of Buda. The lady who owns the bank had no idea that one of the most famous women criminals in the state had robbed the bank and locked the bankers in the vault where she displays merchandise. So yes, there are a lot of instances where people don't even know that the events transpired even in the town, much less in the building.
Did you do any research into the Santa Claus bank robbery out in Cisco?
Yes, that's one of the chapters in the book, and in putting it in the book, to the best of my knowledge, I was the first person since A.C. Green to look at those same historic documents in detail, and I gave a talk, and the Langdon Literary Review at Tarleton State University has an article that I wrote about following the trail of a master storyteller and looking at an incident from the Texas past, and tell my story of going along behind A.C. Green and how we agreed and how we disagreed, because of course his was written as a novel set with a historic setting, but he changed names of people, he created dialogue that we'll never know what was actually said. In some instances, I found the actual words that apparently eluded him. So I was able to get quotes from the actual robbers that he didn't use, which I thought was sort of fun.
It's been a long time ago since I read the book, but it seemed like to me there was one of the robbers that when he got out of prison, they lost track of him. Were you able to account for all?
The one that he really talks about is Robert Hill, who was recruited as the fourth party in the robbery group at the very last minute, and he changed his name in the book, so his real name doesn't appear in A.C. Green's account.
His real name does
not.
Oh, does not. Right. Okay.
And he in the book he gave him a fictionalized name. And he's the one from whom we have the best first-person accounts of the incidents that were published at the time. But they were published only in the Cisco paper. They weren't published in any other papers.
Did you do anything on Jim Miller, Deacon Miller, or anything? No, that was too early, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Whatever happened to the deputy sheriff that aided in the escape? Was he ever?
He was prosecuted, and I've forgotten how long that he was in prison. But he was prosecuted, and Beeville, who was his partner, both of them were prosecuted. I didn't go into that because I was just trying to tell you about the actual kidnappers. I could go on and on and on about this stuff, as you can tell. More comments? Yes, sir.
It seems to me that while the actual abductors that you've written about are a good story, it seems like really the more complex story here is the woman.
Oh, I think so.
And the brains behind the whole operation, because there obviously were probably a handful of people that could have been kidnapped. So what was the psychology behind her deciding this is the one and kind of putting it together from that point? Was it something other than money? Was there revenge or envy or any number of psychological factors that were at play?
My impression is that it was primarily greed. It was greed. Now, there's, needless to say, this chapter is, there have been books written on full books written on the Urschel kidnapping. And I'm sure there will be more. I'm sure there will be more. Yeah, and I have to agree, and I very much wish that I knew more. She grew up, she was a teenager in Coleman, Texas. Her mother ran a boarding house in Coleman. You know, the whole story of Catherine is one that very much merits deeper investigation. Absolutely so. And this is an incident that certainly would render itself well for a cinematic treatment as well. Yeah, it would, you know, there's enough complexity here that it could make a wonderful movie. Yes, sir.
The victim that was kidnapped, what happened to him?
Charles Urschel returned home. Later on, he and Berenice moved to San Antonio, Texas. They lived to a ripe age in San Antonio, and they created a philanthropic foundation in San Antonio with part of their oil wealth. So it continues to benefit people to this very day. Yeah. And apparently had, after this dreadful incident, had a happy life. Pretty remarkable. Yes, sir.
The ransom money, how much was recovered, how much was not recovered?
About half of it was recovered and half of it's never been found. There may very well be Urschel kidnapping money sitting in another thermos bottle in another cotton field.
But they did get all the money at the farm.
They got that. It was around $72,000. Yeah.
Is there any tour now in the Dallas-Fort Worth area like the one you went to before?
Most years in the wintertime, John Neal Phillips, who is the living authority on the Barrow Gang through the Dallas Historical Society, offers a one-day motor coach tour of Barrow Gang sites in the Dallas area. And if you enjoy seeing historic crime scenes, this is the man who's the authority, and it's well worth the nominal 15 or 20 bucks that the day tour costs. So if you're interested, you might contact the Dallas Historical Society in Fair Park, because they're the ones, and he has done this in the dead of winter for about the last dozen years. And the bus is normally full. So I recommend Mr. Phillips's fine tour, and it's the time of the year that they'll probably start advertising it again. So I strongly recommend it for anyone who finds these places of interest. Now, of course, you can take the Gangster Tour book and go to those same crime scenes on your own, but to go with an authority like him really is wonderful. You know, even Clyde Barrow's daddy's filling station still stands. It's an auto detail shop. Yeah, there are wonderful sights.
Do a tour. I don't know if you know who she is.
Well, tell us about it.
Oh, well, it's been probably 10 years, but she's a Dallas historian and has written a lot of books. And she took us on the Clyde Barrow tour.
Very good.
The Fish Trap Cemetery, and went through Oak Cliff.
Chalk Hill?
Yes.
Chalk Hill, where Bonnie lived. Yeah.
And we went where she worked,
Yeah.
downtown, which is now gone. But she showed us the approximate location where she was a waitress.
Did they find her grave over there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
unless you count
very
bushes,
separate.
you won't know where it is unless you count bushes by that mausoleum and find 13th bush. Yeah.
And interestingly, I've never visited Bonnie Parker's grave when there were not recently left grave goods. Fresh flowers, artificial flowers, unusual tokens, a silver dollar, a plastic camp pistol, weird things that people leave on the grave. And every time that I've been there, there have been different grave goods, and I've never been there when there weren't either fresh flowers or the remains of fresh flowers. There's a very interesting, almost a cult of people who go there and leave things. Yeah, very interesting indeed. More questions? I do have back at the table near the entrance copies of the Gangster Tour of Texas book. It's $32 including sales tax. If anyone would like an autographed copy, I'll be more than pleased to inscribe it any way that you wish. And let's thank Mrs. Schooley for having organized this event for all of us today.
Thank you, Dr. Baker, for sharing the story with us. We all enjoyed it.